UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to Life Issues. Now, there have been lots of headlines around social care in recent years. Lots of government promises, lots of political good intent, and lots of calls for action. And yet, there is still a very real sense that across the field, there is much that is wrong. And that, although it's a much used word these days, crisis is the experience for many who are in need of personal care, seeking to provide care, or having to give up work in order to fulfill the role of unpaid carer for a loved one. To quote a recent article in The Guardian, "Dear Mr. Chancellor, I'd love to get a job, but thanks to your social care crisis, I can't. I've had no other choice but to give up my career to become my mother's full-time carer." So what is going on? Is it just about money and investment? Why can't we get it right if other countries can? And if the measure of civilization is how it treats its most vulnerable, what does that say about us? By the way, the original version of that quote is often credited to the Nobel Prize-winning author Pearl Buck. She was the daughter of a missionary, and she wrote, "Our society must make it right and possible for old people not to fear the young or be deserted by them. For the test of a civilization is the way that it cares for its helpless members." The church has long been a place of best practice in care. MHA, or Methodist homes, have a long-established good reputation for quality of care, support and training of those who deliver care. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York recently and, to quote the report, humbly wade into this area with their Commission on Reimagining Care report. It's called Care and Support Reimagined, which looked beyond the needs of older people to also examine the wider structure of support we offer to those who need it. I'm pleased to say that the co-chair of that commission, Dr. Anna Dixon, MBE, joins us today for Life Issues, along with the Reverend Dr. Chris Swift, who is Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at MHA Methodist Homes. So Anna, if I start with you, we hear the headlines, there is much talk of crisis, but where are we exactly and why are we here? Is it a crisis?
Well, it's a crisis that's been brewing for a long time because we're all familiar with the fact that when we fall ill, the NHS is there for us. But sadly, if we have a disability or later in our lives potentially need care and support, unfortunately, there isn't the same provision. And so the responsibility for many people falls on families or for themselves to pay for the care and support they need. Only very sort of the poorest people in our society get any support from the state. That's through their local authority. And even then, it's only really when they are in a crisis. But what has, I guess, happened over the last 10 or more years is that the local authorities have seen very significant budget cuts. And so the care that is provided to people has been more and more rationed. So it's a crisis in the sense that there are adults with disability who are not getting care and support to enable them even to live, a very sort of ordinary life. There are older adults, who have care and support need towards the end of their life, perhaps, or because they have dementia, not getting care. And so the burden falls on family members. And the other crisis is that we have many people giving many hours, giving up work, getting exhausted, feeling very isolated. And the other part of this, I suppose, crisis is that, coming out of COVID and for various other reasons, there are huge vacancies in the paid care workforce. It's an amazing job. And I'm sure that, we'll hear from Chris about some of the amazing care. And there is amazing care being given every day to people in their own homes, in supported living, in retirement communities and care homes. But unfortunately, for many people, they are not getting the care and support to let them live a good life.
And let me put the same question to you, Chris, because you obviously, as part of Methodist Homes, MHA.org is the website, providing in a variety of formats care for people in a variety of situations where they're impacted simply by age or by conditions like dementia. What's your take on this? Do you see that we are in crisis mode at the moment?
I think we're in a chronic, protracted and prolonged crisis that's been around for quite a while. But I think echoing Anna's comments, the COVID in particular and a number of consequences of the pandemic have really intensified the factors that have put social care in a critical state. And I mean, for the first time in its history at the moment, we are just marketing 10 care homes for sale. MHA has not done that at such a scale previously in its 80 years of history. So I think there are real concrete indications of the consequences of a crisis where certainly we know in the 50 to 65-year-old workforce, many people have dropped out of paid work. So we've got a staffing crisis that comes from a number of different directions. I'm sure some of those absences in the workforce are due to long COVID, or perhaps other medical conditions that were exacerbated due to an inability to access healthcare during the pandemic as early as people would like. Anna's mentioned the public funding. It's not a question of blaming local authorities. I know that they have very, very tight budgets with many demands on them, but it's just the realistic fact that sometimes when we have a resident who is being funded publicly, that money is not covering the cost of care. It's simply not meeting the bills that need to be paid. Staffing, I've already touched on. I mean, there's a variety of factors, but we certainly aren't getting the numbers of staff that we'd like to see coming into the sector. And lastly, I guess, cost of living. So you would see figures, but you've never walked into a cold care home. I bet anybody listening to that will be able to say, I've never walked into a cold care home. That requires energy. That requires heating to be there all the time for people who may not be hugely active. We know older people often feel the cold sooner. So the energy costs, for example, in the course of about 13 months for us went from £5 million a year to £18 million a year.
Staggering. I mean, to be honest with you, £5 million a year is staggering, but 18 is just beyond imagining. Yeah. And you talk about consequences, and the truth is, of course, that there are very real consequences for wider society if we do not have an adequately resourced, adequately funded social care industry. Is it fair to call it an industry, do you think?
Well, it is a sector, and it does get referred to as an industry. And as I'm sure, again, many people listening to this will know, the sector is made up from a variety of providers, charities like MHA, not-for-profits, but also providers who might be backed by private equity and so on, who are clearly looking to produce a return on that money for their investors. So there's a variety of models of operation, and particularly the financial side of it out there. So I think there are people, yes, who would regard that as an industry. I would like to think more as a service, but...
Well, fair enough, but I think that probably is defined by the attitude and the ethos of MHA, I think, as much as anything, isn't it? Anna, your take on this?
Well, I mean, you talk there about the economic and social importance of having a functioning care system. The fact is, it is a huge employer in the sense, if you took all the people working in the care sector, let's call it, it's actually more than the NHS. So, it is a big thing. And obviously it's one that's growing as we have an aging population, as more people with disability survive into adulthood, as adults with disability and indeed learning disability are living longer. Actually, the need for care and support is growing. So it's a growth industry. And yet it's a growth industry in which, the people who are doing these really important jobs are on minimum wage. We do not value the carers, the unpaid carers get very little in the way of either financial or practical support for the amazing work that they do. And many of them, this is one of the big economic consequences. withdraw from work. So one of the leading reasons, along with their own ill health, that people over 50 stop being in employment is because of caring responsibilities. So, and obviously it's also a gendered issue. It's more likely to impact women. So this combination of, millions of low pay jobs, if we would pay our workers better within care, that would have a huge economic benefit and social benefit. Those people would, be contributing more to the economy. Most of that pay will go straight back into the local economy, people on those sort of low wages, and it would have social benefits for them and their families and their communities. But also, if we had decent care and support, it would enable more people who want to juggle perhaps work and care to do so and to balance those family responsibilities with work.
And as we're talking today, and as we're recording today, there was in the news a call for the government to recognise the contribution that unpaid carers make and to actually start to look at ways to fund something, to give a sort of financial recompense to people who are saving the country an awful lot of money by simply caring for those that they love. But if it is a crisis, and if we have a situation, for example, that the NHS is directly impacted, there are consequences of the NHS if we don't get social care right because of the way that the two sectors work alongside each other, why can't we fix it? Are our expectations of the state too high in this, do you think, Anna?
Oh, no, I think the other way around. I think they're too low. I think most people don't realise that social care isn't like the NHS until they or a loved one needs it. And it's a big shock to them that they have to find that, they have to effectively spend down even the capital in the house to fund care. So I think that if anything, people really understood, one, what care and support is and how important it is and how what a difference it can make to people's quality of life. And if they understood effectively how little at the moment is provided by the state, I think, there would be a bigger outcry. So effectively, I think we do need the state to step up. And even our radical proposals and those of others, are calling for a much more generous state entitlement to care and support for many more people. It is totally, the numbers are still small relative to how much we spend on the NHS, how much we spend on pensions. So I think we've got stuck in a debate about how are we going to pay for care and support. We need to really be having the debate about what is the value of this? What is it? Why is it so important? And, in a sense, the public should be demanding from their politicians that we should be having better care and support.
And the recognition of the value and the quality of workers, Chris, is something that I know MHA have been campaigning on and speaking out on for a long time. Given that you are so committed to training your workers and bringing a high level of professionalism to what they deliver, would you agree with Anna that there isn't the recognition of the quality of care, both in terms of status, but also in terms of pay?
I think it is undervalued. Despite many attempts on MHA's one provider, in April, we awarded a 10% pay rise to the vast majority of our staff. That felt the right thing to do, but there's also a practical consideration. If we don't pay and attract workers, then you end up having to use agency to run safe and correctly staffed services, and that costs you more. So I think sometimes providers are in a catch-22 position with that. But absolutely, I do agree and believe that we should value much more the work that, my mother had dementia and was in a care home some years ago. And I can remember turning up outside the room and I didn't go in because I could hear there was a carer with her. And I just overheard the patience, the skill, the compassion of the care that was being given. And the carer didn't know I was there. So it was a great moment just to think, this is a good place for her to be. And it really matters. But when you think, somebody stacking shelves in a supermarket might not be earning a dissimilar amount of money, the care and the skill that is required in social care and the unsociable hours very often and so on, which can have an impact on family life, it really does need to be more recognised. And I think at the heart of all of that and all the things we're talking about is a kind of casual or even less casual ageism in society. Why do we value this so little?
Well, that's a question hopefully we'll endeavour to answer as we talk together today. You are listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. My guests are Dr. Anna Dixon, MBE. She is the co-chair of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, their commission on reimagining care. Their reimagining care report is called Care and Support Reimagined. And she's joined by the Reverend Dr. Chris Swift, who is Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at MHA Methodist Homes. Looking at the report, Anna, there was a line in it which jumped out at me. It says, inaction is a collective sin. If we don't do something about this, it seemed to imply there is a spiritual element to this that we need to recognise, not just a societal element. So I wonder if you could talk us, in the thumbnail version, because we've got limited time, but talk us through some of the calls that come from the report and the changes that you are looking for.
Well, it was a really interesting and somewhat challenging commission that we were given by the Archbishops, which was to look at reimagining care, so putting together a radical vision, drawing on Christian theology and values. Well, thankfully, I had as my co-chair the Bishop of Carlisle, and he is not only the speaker in the Lords on health and social care, but obviously as a bishop brought his theology knowledge. We also had another theologian on the commission. And this really led us to think about, what is it about our understanding of God, how we are created in God's image, each worthy and loved by God. And it was this sort of thinking that I think really imbued our considerations about not saying we need care and support because the NHS is on its needs, not saying we need care and support because, we were talking before about the economics of it, but actually saying, this is about, I guess, a moral and theological and spiritual issue, that if we do value people in the way that God sees us, then we would want for everyone to be able to live what we call to flourish, to have an abundant life, to have a fulfilling life. And so I suppose the thought that followed that was our failure to ensure that people get the care and support that they need to live a full life. That inaction is itself a form of sin in God's eyes. It's a turning away from what God would wish for us as human beings, to love one another and to express that love in loving kindness and care for everyone, particularly for people with disability and those who might need support in old age.
Which does drop the issue then and the conversation around social care very squarely in the lap of the church, doesn't it? I mean, the church voice on this should be crystal clear and should be, well, I was going to say very loud, but that sounds a little sort of crass to say. But in essence, it's true. We should be one of the loudest voices in the room around this. So there were three main changes that the Commission called for in the report.
The first one was to rethink attitudes. This very point that we don't really see care and support as this means to have a good life. We don't see it more perhaps than just the washing, dressing, getting somebody up. In fact, it's so much more than that. From the people we spoke to, who are drawing on care and support, those who are giving care and support, they recognize that it's the emotional, it's the spiritual, it's the social, all of these aspects are part of a bigger understanding of care and support. So rethinking attitudes, not only to care and support, but I think, as Chris was alluding to, also to our underlying attitudes to age and to disability. And that goes for the church as well. We did in the report challenge the church about its own attitudes to aging and disability. thankfully, I think the church has seized this, and it's brilliant that both the archbishops have used their platform, their authority to speak out on this. The Archbishop of Canterbury in his New Year's message spoke about it, and they obviously did a lot of media interviews. So I think the first thing, this idea of rethinking attitudes. The second was about rebalancing roles and responsibilities. We talked a little about the role of the state, but we think it's really important to recognise the role of communities, the role of families, and all of us as individuals. We think that should be set out in something called a National Care Covenant, which would make explicit what our mutual roles are and responsibilities to one another. The third area is, I guess, where we get into actually how do you redesign care? How do you make a radical rethink of how care and support is organised, delivered, paid for? And so that was our third area.
And Chris, if I bring you in on this, I mean, I would suspect that many of these elements that are coming out of the report are music to your ears, because the spiritual impact of care and the need to be taking how we deliver care forward in a radical way to really meet people's changing needs in an aging society. I mean, that's stuff that is your bread and butter. That's your everyday wheelhouse at MHA, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the recognition and the enabling of participation and engagement with people in our work. I think it's really important to me in my time with MHA, 6 years, not to think of this as the doers and the done to. And I think to enable people to have a valued contribution. So one very small thing I've done, but I think for me has theological and spiritual significance, is when I arrived, the person in my role would say a prayer before the board meeting of the trustees, the governing body of MHA, people who decide how to spend £250 million a year. And I decided me saying a prayer wasn't always the most exciting thing that could happen at the start of a meeting. And so I began interviewing a resident who was willing to say, can you just say a bit about what it's like living here at MHA? And would you say a prayer for the board? So a board meeting begins by one of our residents praying for those people. And I think that emphasizes that spirit of reciprocity, of involvement, of value. And the chair of the organization would then write that person a thank you letter and pick up on aspects of what they prayed for. And it's a lovely thing to do. It's a very small thing, but it sets an agenda and a tone. And I think the church in particular does have a very important role in symbolically taking actions that perhaps help begin to shift and change attitudes.
And when you start to change attitudes like that, what does it do for those who are, and you're right, we do need to get away from the idea of those who do and those who are done to, but nonetheless, there are those who are receiving that service of care. What does it do for their personal perspective when you start to include them in the conversation like that, rather than just have the conversation about them?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think it is very affirming of dignity. I can remember one of these that I did was a lady who had a diagnosis of dementia. Clearly, in how she spoke and communicated, it was evident there were elements of dementia in her life and in her well-being, but she still wanted to do it. We still enabled that participation. And I thought, it's so important that we don't lose faith with anybody at any stage of life, and find ways, and that's the challenge sometimes to us, to enable, to empower, to allow people to be themselves as much as they can be within the situation where they are. And I think for MHA, for me, it's about keeping faith with later life, and that never stops. And we will always try. We're very big on music therapy, the largest employer in the UK of music therapists, which has a profound effect very often on people living with dementia. And there are always ways and new ways that we should be looking for to affirm human worth and dignity. And nobody is any further away from God than any of the rest of us. And sometimes we need to sit and listen and recognize how somebody's showing us something of God in their life. And that may surprise us from whom it comes, as we know scripturally so often it did. that it wasn't the expected people who brought that nearness of God's kingdom into our lives. It was those who everybody else looked away from.
The thing is, good practice like that and the development of things like music therapy and paying a decent wage to staff and so on, it all requires money. And I think most people, if you ask them what is wrong with social care in our society, Anna, will go, well, it's funding, and it's funding. If we had more money spent on it, then people would be able to do more, and it would be better. I mean, what is the reality about the lack of progress in terms of reform for funding of the care that we need to give our ageing population?
Well, I think we chose to almost reverse the question because, yes, of course, we do need more funding going in. As I mentioned, we've mentioned at least three things: lack of pay of the people who are in there, the fees that are paid by local authorities to providers to enable them to provide a good quality of care, and money to support perhaps a bit more for unpaid carers to enable them to not end up in poverty. So definitely there is money needed for all of the reasons that we've talked about. But I think one of the things in our report that really struck us was just how much is already given in many other ways, through informal care by family members, by neighbours, by faith communities, both to members of their faith communities, but also through providing support to the wider community around them. And I think we need to recognise that investing in that doesn't necessarily require a lot of money, but we do need to recognise it as an important part of this wider care and support, maybe network, whatever we want to call it. Without that, even more would fall to the state. People would be even more calling upon formal services. And so to support that, it may be more about tools and resources. So one of the things we're looking at is how to equip faith communities who want to do something. So hopefully there will be people listening to this who think, actually, I'm not sure our church, really does enough for disabled adults in our community. We'd like to find out, what support there is already. So find out what else is going on, see if there's anything we could add to that. We would say, talk to the people themselves. This should be about finding out what they want rather than thinking that we know best. So actually, yes, somewhere in that there is a bit of money needed for the voluntary and community sector for some of that activity, but it's not the first thing that's needed. For that, I think it's about a different sort of nurturing and investment of community and community support.
But there is also a need, Chris, for professional support to be delivered. I mean, something like, I think, 165,000 vacancies in social care in the UK in a variety of formats. I mean, is that just down to money, or is there are lots of sectors, Chris, where people work vocationally because they believe in the service they are delivered. And as a rule, vocational work doesn't pay as well as other sectors of work. So, I mean, is there a sense that we need to change the attitude of those who work in the field to see the value of their vocation?
I think that the sector does need to be able to communicate, and I know the government has had a recruitment campaign and advertising on this as well, where people speak very passionately about their own vocational commitment who are already in care to try and demonstrate that. I mean, I think that is right, but I never want vocation to be used as a markdown for the value that we place on somebody's work. And yes, it should be recognised, but we recognise there's a vocational element to being a doctor and to being a nurse and so on, and the pay in social care does not compare with the NHS, for example. So I think it is more than just a vocational clip, as it were, within the salary. I think it is a genuine systemic and long-standing underfunding.
Is there a need for us, and this is perhaps about reimagining our attitude towards care and the way in which we frame it in our own minds, There's long been a call to professionalise the sector and to give to social care the same sort of training and status and respect that we might give to nursing or to other elements of medical care. What do you think about that? I mean, do we need to actually raise the bar on those who do care, Anna, and treat them accordingly?
Well, in our report, we're very clear that we do need to pay more, but that's not the only thing that's going to enable more people to come into care jobs and to stay in care. We need to give people training, a career, opportunities to progress. And I think that can come with what you might call professionalisation. And certainly we feel that there's a lot more that can be done to recognise the training and skills that people gain and the experience that they gain. And that should be recognised in the form of perhaps certification or qualification that they can take to other jobs and can enable them to progress potentially to jobs across in the NHS and then return to care at another level, having gained experience. So I think for people to be able to move between care jobs and NHS jobs, there is a need for greater parity and a much clearer career progression and opportunities for training and qualification.
Because there is a sense, Chris, and I don't mean this in any disrespectful way to those who work for you or those who work, like my daughter-in-law, for example, who works in the sector. But there is a sense that for some carers, if they can't do anything else, they can always do care. That sort of attitude. And that's not necessarily a healthy way to paint the sector, is it?
No, well, I think that goes back to the number of vacancies you were talking about, the 165,000, is that we would always want to have values-based recruitment and really look for the people who have a passion for this work and a very strong and appropriate motivation. I don't know whether everybody else providing in the sector necessarily puts the same emphasis on that, particularly when it is so hard to fill positions. So I think echoing what Anna said, I absolutely agree about the opportunities for training and development. I sometimes say to chaplains, because we have chaplains in all our residential facilities, I say, you may be the only person working there with a degree. Mm. You would never say that in the NHS. Mm. You wouldn't enter a ward where you weren't working with other professionals who are highly trained, and that training in itself communicates a recognition of the skill and the value and the commitment people need to make with their mind, heart and soul to doing that kind of work.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond, my guest this week, talking around the realities of and perhaps the crisis in the social care sector are the Reverend Dr. Chris Swift, who is Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at MHA, Methodist Homes, MHA.org, and also Dr. Anna Dixon, MBE, who is the co-chair of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York's Commission on Care, and they have produced the report Care and Support Reimagined, a National Care Covenant for England. You've both alluded to and sometimes very directly pointed out, as we've been talking today, the importance of the spirituality of care as well. I wonder if we could talk for a moment, and as we draw to a conclusion, about that for those who are recipients of care, whether that be because of age or because of illness or because of disability or because of learning needs or whatever. It is so important, Chris, that we get the attitude right to see those who are vulnerable as spiritual people, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, it is. And we see that obviously residents in our services can come to a church service, as it were, that the chaplain might be leading in the home, and often people who may not have a very significant level of engagement. Of course, due to that kind of asset in so many of our older people's lives of a religious education or upbringing or Sunday school, suddenly recognize a hymn or some familiar words like the Lord's Prayer and engage with that very much wholeheartedly. And it's a delight to see that. But I also think, as we mentioned earlier, in the experience of dementia, sometimes people see and experience the world differently, but no less spiritually. And we'll have a wonder perhaps in the created world and just, enjoy watching a tree moving in a breeze and thinking of God's presence alive in the world. And we need to realize, faith is not something solely something which is articulated intellectually or in words, but that people have genuine experiences of sacredness in their lives and in many different ways. And those who care and stand and work alongside people, I believe, come to recognize that.
And Anna, in the report, again and again, as we've alluded to, there is this call for a change of attitude, to look at things differently, to have a different perspective about this. What attitude shifts do you think are needed to enable disabled or older people to really feel that they are a part of the spiritual community, either in a care home or in a church or in a faith community? How do we need to think differently to enable them to feel that they are a part of it?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to stop thinking them and us, and it has to be about we. This is all of us, and at some time in our lives we will either need care or be a caregiver, and I think that idea of what we share, that we are all, as I said before, made in God's image, I think has to be at the heart of how we approach our attitudes to age and disability. I think there's been a bit of a tendency within the church to sort of very much focus on how do we get young people to, join the church, be part of the church. And of course, we do want people to come to faith, but we want people to come to faith at all ages. And I think there are a lot of people who are spiritually searching into old age and later life. And when people become carers or become ill or disabled, it can be an opportunity where they're actually, it's a life transition, it's a life-changing time, and they can be more open perhaps to seeking. And I think we need to be ready to welcome people. I think that we need to think about how inclusive our worship is. I've been to some wonderful services where, everybody's participated in the way that they can. So learning disabled people had streamers and banners, and during the worship songs, they were dancing and showing exuberance and joy of the Spirit in a way which was absolutely a gift within that service. But it does mean that we have to think very differently about how to make the worship inclusive. It's not just about step-free access to the church or do we have a disabled toilet. It needs to be fundamentally about how worship is structured, how it enables everybody to express and participate. So I think there are some attitudinal shifts that if we take this view, it also changes how we do mission. So again, not seeing it as we're here to do something for vulnerable and needy people in our community, but rather asking the question, how can we support you to live a good life? What could that look like? And what have you got to contribute, and how we can help you to contribute within our wider community?
Because there isn't a need, perhaps, Chris, for church communities, faith communities, wider community as well, perhaps, to recognise, as we are starting to see the importance of being a friendly space for people who are neurodiverse, for example, then there's also a need for us to recognise that sort of patience, tolerance, creating understanding that allows those who are living with older age, disability, dementia to be a part of what we are doing, to be supported. Community can make a difference, can't it?
Yes, it can. It can make a profound difference, I think, to people. And I like the language you're using there, because I think it is about inclusivity. I mean, I can understand where people are coming from talking about dementia-friendly churches and so on. But I think the aim, particularly maybe for a main weekly service, is to include as many people as possible, because that's most representative of the kingdom of God. And just as one small thing, I would say to some churches sometimes I go to, and I think actually if somebody was perhaps more connected to distant memories in their life about church and so on, is there a piece of music? Is there a hymn on a Sunday that would connect with them? Even if it's just one. But it's great to have the new stuff. It's great to concentrate on young people. But can we just also remember this is about everybody and the kinds of music that a variety of people will connect with in order to express their spirituality?
Is this the sort of topic, Anna, that needs to be included more in the sermon and the teaching and the conversation that's had formally in church?
Oh, I would hope so. And I hope part of the work we've done and the sponsorship of this work by the archbishops is opening up that opportunity to recognise that. There are also lots of other spiritual resources now available for the Anna chaplaincy is a specific type of chaplaincy that's serving older people in the community. So I think there's a lot out there for leaders to potentially draw on, but I think we have to make it easier for leaders to equip them with that understanding. We've talked about different ways of doing worship, but I think we can't expect too much of our church leaders. There's a lot that they have to do. I say making it easier to equip them with a basic understanding of dementia and what would help, or a basic understanding of people with learning disability or disability, and what small changes they might make that would make things more inclusive. But I do also hope and pray that this will be an awakening to really the wonderful contribution of people with disability and in older age, and for churches to see this as something where they can both give and receive through both inclusion in their faith community, but also in thinking about how they could contribute through their social action to supporting people in the wider community to live well. And lots of churches do. They open their doors, memory cafes, friendship cafes, opportunities for people to come in. We've seen the churches do an amazing with warm spaces, helping people who might be otherwise suffering at home in the cold alone. A lot of older people in particular have benefited from that. So providing that warm welcome, thinking about how social action can enable people to live well. I mean, my own niece who has autism, she got as first as volunteer in a church-based cafe that gave her the confidence to recognise that she had something to contribute, and she went on from there to gain in confidence and have a job. I think just we can be supportive places, supportive employment opportunities. All of these things are things that faith communities could and should, I hope, be doing to support people.
And of course, Chris, if you have a residential home in your church's area, then in all likelihood, the staff and the management there would be more than happy to create a space and to engage a little closer with their local faith community.
Yes, they would. And it's really good to do that and make sure that we don't have any walls between those institutions and the wider community. So I think lots of contact. And of course, it was one of the worst, well, not the worst, but one of the many consequences of the pandemic, that sort of interaction was not able to happen in the same way as it had previously. So I think it may take a bit of effort, and it's necessary effort to get back into the pattern of maintaining those sorts of connections.
Let's be honest. For most of us who are well and healthy and able to function, there is a danger that we can view those who are less able, less well, less healthy, with a degree of condescension, that they need to be helped, that they need to be supported, that they need to be cared for. And whilst that may be the actuality, if we are going to honour the truth of God's heart for all of us, we need to honour the value and the individuality of every person. We need to recognise and value what they can contribute. We need to create space where that contribution can not only be welcomed, but also be nurtured and encouraged and allowed to flourish. Social care may be in crisis. The answer to it is not necessarily just to throw money at it, though. Surely the answer is for a change of attitude that starts to value and respect those who are recipients of care as the you and I at some point in our lives that they really are. And if more of us were able to do that, perhaps then we would have a better understanding of the value of care, a better appreciation for those who deliver good care, and a greater willingness to lift up our voice and see that care is a spiritual ministry as much as many others. You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. My guests this week have been Dr. Anna Dixon, who is the co-chair of the Archbishop's Commission on Care. Care and Support Reimagined, a National Care Covenant for England is their report. And also Reverend Dr. Chris Swift, Director of Chaplaincy and Spirituality at MHA Methodist Homes, MHA.org. Anna, Chris, thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you also to Rachel, my producer, for this week. Why not join us next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da!